Carl Jung's warning about empaths wasn't a soft caution about emotional sensitivity. It was something far darker. He wasn't concerned that empaths felt too much. He was alarmed by how they absorbed the psychological material of others to the point of losing themselves entirely. Jung documented what he referred to as archetypal vulnerability, a psychic openness that allows empaths to become unconscious vessels for the collective's unresolved trauma, shadow, and archetypal possession. His concern wasn't hypothetical. He saw it firsthand. One particular case stunned him. A young woman entered his office, speaking in voices that weren't her own. She wept for strangers, felt grief that didn't belong to her, and described herself as a container filled with other people's emotions. Most hauntingly, she couldn't remember her own name. Despite the dramatic symptoms, Jung didn't dismiss her as delusional. Every emotional insight she expressed about others proved accurate hidden depressions, buried anger, unspoken trauma. She was psychically absorbing emotional data with terrifying precision. "I am everyone and no one," she whispered. "I know what people feel, but I've forgotten what it feels like to be me." This was more than empathy. This was what Jung would later describe as unconscious possession. A complete collapse of psychological boundaries. She hadn't merely picked up emotional cues. She had become a psychological sponge, soaking up others' pain until her own identity dissolved. The origins of her gift were just as tragic. Jung discovered that, as a child, she had survived by reading her father's volatile moods to avoid his outbursts. What began as hypervigilance, a necessary defense mechanism, had evolved into a dangerous psychic habit. After years of constantly attuning to others' emotions, she no longer knew where they ended, and she began. This case revealed something chilling. Empaths don't just feel others' emotions. They unconsciously absorb fragments of other people's personalities. Their gift, unchecked, becomes a mechanism for psychological disintegration. Jung named this process psychic invasion, and he outlined 3 key mechanisms that make empaths vulnerable: shadow magnetism, archetypal hijacking, and identity liquefaction. Shadow magnetism is when empaths attract and absorb the shadow material others unconsciously reject. When people can't face their own rage, guilt, or shame, they project it, and the empath absorbs it. It's not intentional, it's energetic. The empath becomes the path of least resistance. Jung described this using a metaphor of psychic electricity, suppressed grief. For instance, will leap across that energetic gap and find a home in the empath. Suddenly, they feel overwhelming sadness with no idea why. This phenomenon, what Jung called projective identification, is where unconscious psychological content is not just projected, but implanted into another psyche. The empath doesn't realize they're carrying someone else's emotional debris. They feel it as if it were their own. This explains why so many empaths experience seemingly irrational anxiety, depression, or fatigue. They're haunted by ghosts that aren't theirs. But shadow magnetism is only the beginning. The second mechanism Jung uncovered is archetypal hijacking. This is when universal psychic patterns, like the wounded healer, the eternal martyr, or the divine mother, use an empath's sensitivity as an entry point into their psyche. These archetypes are ancient forces embedded in the collective unconscious. When an empath identifies too strongly with them, they don't become healers, they become possessed. At first, it might look noble. The empath feels a strong pull to help someone. They sense energy around healing work. They feel called, but slowly, the archetype begins to overtake them. Jung wrote, "The wounded healer whispers, 'Your pain only has meaning if it heals others.' And the empath, desperate for purpose, listens without realizing it. They surrender their personal will to a pattern much older and more powerful than themselves. What starts as compassion becomes compulsion. They become obsessed with saving people. They can't rest until someone else is okay. But this need to help isn't coming from their conscious self. It's coming from the archetypal possession. And the more they comply, the more their own identity erodes, which leads to the third and final mechanism, identity liquefaction. This is the collapse of the self under the weight of chronic psychological absorption. Jung observed that in severe cases, empaths lost access to their own feelings, desires, and memories. They didn't just feel lost, they were lost. Their personality had become a mosaic of absorbed fragments. First, they lose clarity about their preferences. Simple questions, what do you want? How do you feel? Become impossible to answer. Then, their emotional responses become erratic. They cry at joy, they laugh at grief. Their reactions reflect other people's unresolved emotions rather than their own authentic experience. Finally, their identity dissolves altogether. They become what Jung called a psychological cemetery. a repository for other people's unlived lives and disowned emotions, while their own soul shrivels from neglect. But Jung's most disturbing realization wasn't about the empath's condition. It was about how others instinctively exploit them. He discovered a psychological predator pattern. Narcissists, manipulators, and emotionally immature individuals, without realizing it, seek out empaths, not to connect, but to offload. These predators don't operate with conscious malice. Jung found they were driven by what he called shadow hunger, an unconscious craving to dump the parts of themselves they couldn't bear to face. They don't say, "Let me find someone to absorb my shame and rage." But psychically, that's exactly what happens. And empaths, especially those without boundaries, become the perfect containers. Jung documented how these individuals gravitate toward empaths in every setting: friend groups, workplaces, families. The predator presents themselves as a uniquely wounded soul in need of special understanding. They trigger the empath's innate need to help. They display carefully crafted vulnerability, activating what Jung called rescue addiction in the empath. Then the cycle begins. The empath pours energy into helping. The predator improves temporarily, but only because the empath has absorbed their pain. It's not healing, it's psychic transference. The predator feels lighter. The empath feels depleted. But rather than retreating, the empath feels even more obligated to help, because now they're emotionally entangled. Jung identified this pattern as trauma bonding, a subconscious fusion where the empath becomes responsible for the predator's emotional regulation. It's not a relationship, it's a one-way drain. And the irony, the very trait that gives the empath their strength, deep feeling, becomes the exact vulnerability the predator exploits. Jung's case files were full of these dynamics. One empath reported crippling panic attacks after interactions with a friend who always came to her in crisis. Another described falling apart after ending a relationship with someone who had emotionally leaned on them for years. These weren't isolated issues. They were systematic patterns of psychic exploitation. But the damage doesn't stop with psychological exhaustion. Jung identified 4 distinct stages of empathic destruction, each a deeper descent into identity erosion and shadow contamination. Stage 1, the overwhelmed innocent. This is the empath who feels everything, but understands none of it. Crowded places drain them. Random waves of emotion paralyze them. They feel guilt, sadness, or anxiety seemingly without cause. Most tragically, they blame themselves for their suffering, thinking they're just too sensitive. They have no idea they're carrying other people's emotional debris. Jung gave the example of a young teacher who suffered panic attacks in her classroom. After investigation, it became clear she wasn't reacting to her own stress. She was absorbing the collective anxiety of 30 students. Stage 2, the compulsive fixer. Now the empath begins to find purpose in their pain. They become obsessed with helping the broken. Every relationship revolves around rescue, but they don't see this as codependency. They call it love. Jung observed that their sense of identity becomes tied entirely to others' problems. If no one needs them, they feel worthless. At this stage, the empath unconsciously seeks out those in crisis. They're drawn to addicts, narcissists, or chronically unstable people, not from true compassion, but from a psychological compulsion to be needed. Jung called this savior syndrome, and he warned that it's deeply deceptive. The empath believes they're doing sacred work, but in reality, they're abandoning their own development in favor of managing someone else's chaos. Their relationships follow a painful pattern, an intense emotional connection with a wounded individual, followed by burnout. Either the person improves and no longer needs the empath, or they remain stuck, rejecting all help, leaving the empath feeling resentful, exhausted, and confused. Stage 3, the spiritual martyr. This is where things get dangerous. The empath begins using spiritual language to justify their suffering. They reframe emotional depletion as unconditional love. They see burnout as a noble sacrifice. They begin to believe that their purpose is to carry the pain of others. Jung observed that this spiritual rationalization creates what he called sacred suffering syndrome. At this point, the empath is no longer just absorbing emotional material, they're actively seeking it. They believe their pain is meaningful only when it serves others. Healing becomes a threat to their identity. They fear that if they develop boundaries or reclaim their own energy, they'll lose their divine role. This spiritual bypassing makes them resistant to help. Therapy is dismissed. Boundaries are seen as selfish, and any suggestion that they should protect their own energy is interpreted as a betrayal of their purpose. Stage 4, the identity ghost. This is the final collapse, the point at which the empath no longer has a stable identity. They have absorbed so much psychological material from others that their original self is buried beneath layers of foreign emotional residue. Jung described these individuals as walking emotional composites, patchworks of everyone they've tried to save. He documented cases where empaths spoke in different voices, displayed emotions that didn't match their current situation, or felt like they were filled with strangers. One patient put it chillingly, "I'm a collection of everyone I've tried to help, but I can't find the one who started collecting." Jung emphasized that this descent is not inevitable, but without conscious intervention, empaths often slide down this path slowly. Each stage, a deeper entanglement with unprocessed shadow material. And this leads us to Jung's central insight: why empathy, when unconscious, becomes deadly. It's not just emotional exhaustion, it's personality fragmentation. Empaths begin to lose clarity about their beliefs, opinions, and desires. They agree with whoever they're around because they can't separate their own thoughts from those they've absorbed. Jung called this state reality distortion syndrome. An empath might laugh at a funeral or feel dread at a celebration, not because they're unstable, but because their emotional responses are being dictated by external psychic material, not their internal truth. Over time, this distortion erodes decision-making. Empaths begin choosing paths not based on desire, but on what others want from them. They lose the ability to identify what they genuinely want versus what they've absorbed through constant emotional osmosis. And the deeper danger, vicarious trauma accumulation. Jung observed that empaths often display symptoms of trauma from events they never personally experienced. A woman might have nightmares of war zones she's never visited. A man might experience deep grief from losses that weren't his. Jung treated a patient who suffered from panic attacks and visions of World War I trenches, only to discover she had internalized her grandfather's unprocessed war trauma. She displayed full PTSD symptoms for a life she hadn't lived. Jung called this inherited PTSD psychic material, passed through emotional resonance, not DNA. Empaths don't just pick up feelings, they carry ancestral wounds, collective grief, and generational trauma, often without any understanding of where it originated. The most catastrophic stage Jung identified is archetypal possession crisis. This is when an archetype like the wounded healer completely overrides the empath's personality. The empath now believes their suffering is cosmic duty. They cannot imagine being whole, because their identity is built around being broken for others' benefit. Jung called this sacred suffering and warned that those possessed by it become resistant to healing, convinced that recovery is selfish or spiritually regressive. Traditional therapy often fails here, suggesting healing threatens the archetype's grip. The empath resists change, not because they don't want it, but because they believe their pain has meaning that will be lost if it's resolved. This possession also creates emotional chaos. The empath cannot distinguish between authentic and absorbed material. They live in a psychic fog, memories, feelings, desires blending together with no clarity on what actually belongs to them. One of Jung's patients described it this way: "It's like living in a house where every room belongs to someone else, but I don't remember which room is mine." So what's the solution? Jung didn't want empaths to suppress their gifts. He wanted them to integrate them. He developed a set of practices to transform absorption into conscious perception, a process he referred to as boundary alchemy. Jung's boundary alchemy was not about shutting down empathy. It was about learning to navigate it with precision. The first tool in this process was what he called the archaeological dig, a method of excavating the authentic self from beneath layers of absorbed psychic material. Empaths were instructed to become emotional detectives throughout the day. They would track their feelings, noting what arose, when it started, and who they were with. They would ask questions like, does this emotion match what's actually happening in my life? When did I first feel this way? Is this mine, or did I pick it up from someone else? Jung taught that most overwhelming feelings were foreign artifacts, not native to the empath's inner world. By treating these emotions as clues, not truths, empaths began reclaiming sovereignty over their inner landscape. He called this practice emotional archaeology, digging through psychic layers, dating each emotional imprint to a time, place, or person. Some emotions belonged to childhood trauma. Others came from a partner's unresolved wounds. Many weren't even from this lifetime. They were ancestral echoes. The goal was not to reject emotion, but to sort it. What's mine? What's yours? What belongs to the collective? Jung believed that this sorting process was essential for reestablishing psychological boundaries. He expanded on this with what he termed shadow sorting protocols. These taught empaths to distinguish in real time which feelings were self-generated and which were absorbed With enough practice, this developed what he called psychic forensics, the ability to trace psychic contamination back to its source and remove it consciously. Jung also introduced a more advanced method for dealing with possession by archetypes, archetypal negotiation through active imagination. Instead of being dominated by archetypes like the wounded healer or eternal mother, empaths were guided to enter internal dialogue with these forces using visualization. They would meet the archetype perhaps as an elder medicine woman or a monk or a maternal figure and set boundaries. I will serve healing, but not at the cost of my soul. I will help, but I won't bleed for everyone who suffers. This transformed the archetype from a possessor into an ally. The force remained, but now in collaboration with the empath's will, not in opposition to it. Next, Jung taught empaths to build what he called energetic containers, semi-permeable membranes of psychic protection. These were not walls, they were filters. They allowed love, compassion, and connection in, but filtered out toxic projections and emotional residue. Through guided visualization, empaths would imagine themselves surrounded by a membrane that allowed emotional information to flow, but only when consciously permitted. Jung's goal wasn't emotional numbness. It was what he called conscious empathy. This is the ability to feel with others without becoming them. The empath remains grounded in their own identity, while still deeply connecting to the emotional states of others. Over time, this container became second nature. Empaths learned how to stay centered, even in emotionally charged environments. They could sense suffering without being consumed by it, and offer support without becoming a receptacle for pain that wasn't theirs to carry. Jung explored historical examples of this transformation to demonstrate the difference between absorption casualties and integration masters. Absorption casualty, Virginia Woolf. Through her writings, letters, and diaries, Woolf revealed a pattern of empathic overload. She absorbed the emotional tension of post-war society, her family's unprocessed trauma, and the psychological chaos of her social circle. She described herself as a recording consciousness, something that registered everything but belonged to nothing. Her porous psychic boundaries, combined with overwhelming collective projections, ultimately led to her collapse. Integration master, Maya Angelou. In contrast, Angelou embodied what Jung would have called alchemical empathy. She could hold the weight of collective trauma, racism, abuse, oppression, and transform it into wisdom through language, art, and presence. She remained deeply sensitive but anchored. Her work resonated because it came from a place of integrated wholeness. She didn't carry others' pain for them. She helped translate it into healing. Jung emphasized that the difference between the two wasn't just personality or talent, it was structure. Integrated empaths had clear boundaries, practiced regular energetic hygiene, maintained relationships with people who respected their sensitivity, built rituals and routines that helped them release absorbed material. In contrast, unstructured empaths lived in emotional chaos, constantly flooded, lacking the internal scaffolding to manage their sensitivity, to help others avoid the same fate. Jung proposed the idea of empath sanctuaries, intentional communities designed to support the psychological health of sensitive individuals. These sanctuaries were not about retreating from the world, but about creating safe containers for healing, reflection, and inner work. Jung believed that without such environments, empaths would always be vulnerable to manipulation and isolation. He taught empaths to recognize healthy allies, people who respected the word no, could discuss emotions without shutting down or overpowering, understood the difference between feeling with and fixing for, maintained their own emotional center, even during others' distress. These people, he said, demonstrated what he called integrated sensitivity. Empaths, Jung emphasized, must learn to discern between those who uplift their sensitivity and those who exploit it. To do this, he taught them how to identify predator patterns, individuals who unconsciously, or sometimes consciously, feed off empathic energy. He warned about the subtle signs, people who rapidly overshare trauma, forming quick emotional bonds that demand caretaking, those who resist boundaries, responding to no with guilt, anger, or manipulation, individuals who improve after venting to an empath, while the empath feels drained, foggy, or emotionally hijacked. Sophisticated predators who study empaths' behavior, learn their triggers, and strategically activate their rescue instincts through choreographed vulnerability. These people don't just hurt empaths, they hook them. And once that hook is in, it's very difficult to get out without a conscious, structured process of detachment. To counteract this, Jung advocated for sacred space creation, not just in physical environments, but in psychological ecosystems. These are communities where empaths are not expected to carry everyone's burden, but are honored for their gift, while being encouraged to maintain boundaries. In these spaces, sensitivity is respected, not exploited. Boundaries are seen as acts of maturity, not rejection. Emotional awareness is paired with psychological development. Empaths are reminded regularly, you can serve healing without self-erasure. Jung warned against toxic spiritual communities that exploit empaths by glorifying self-sacrifice, promoting guilt over boundary setting, or masking emotional manipulation as spiritual teaching. These environments feed off empathic labor while offering little in return. Instead, he urged empaths to seek professional support, therapists trained in both psychological and energetic literacy. Traditional talk therapy might not suffice if it dismisses the very foundation of the empath's experience, the energetic, unconscious exchange of psychic material. Empaths need guides who can help them navigate both emotional and energetic dimensions. This professional guidance becomes essential during what Jung identified as the 5 stages of empathic transformation. The path from unconscious absorption to conscious alchemy. Stage 1. Crisis recognition. This begins when the empath system collapses. It may look like burnout, chronic illness, or a breakdown, but it's not random. It's the weight of carrying too much psychic material for too long. The crisis forces the empath to confront the truth. Their current approach is unsustainable. Jung called this the dark night of the empath's soul, the moment where suffering can no longer be spiritualized or ignored. It's the breakdown before the breakthrough. Stage 2. Boundary archaeology. This is where the empath begins excavating their true self from beneath years, sometimes decades of absorbed projections, family trauma, and collective pain. Jung guided empaths through a process of emotional detective work, spending intentional time in solitude to discover their emotional baseline, gradually reintroducing social contact to observe energetic shifts, asking core questions. What emotions are mine? What values are mine? What pain have I inherited? And what do I still choose to carry? Many empaths are shocked by what they find. That much of what they believed defined them was actually foreign content they've unconsciously housed. Stage 3. Archetypal dialogue. In this phase, empaths confront the psychic forces that have possessed them, like the martyr, the healer, or the mother. Using Jung's method of active imagination, they speak directly to these archetypes. I honor your wisdom, but I will not suffer endlessly in your name. I will serve healing, but not through depletion. Through this dialogue, the archetype is transformed from a domineering internal entity into a co-creative ally. The empath becomes the conscious alchemist rather than the unconscious host. Stage 4. Identity reclamation. Here, the empath begins to rediscover what they truly love, need, and believe. Preferences return. Desires become clear. Decisions start to reflect authentic selfhood rather than obligation or guilt. It's often a bittersweet phase. Old relationships dissolve. People who benefited from the empath's lack of boundaries resist their growth. The empath must grieve not only the false self they maintained, but the acceptance they received in that false role. But what emerges is profound. A self no longer defined by sacrifice, but by sovereignty. Stage 5. Conscious service. Now the empath becomes what Jung called a conscious vessel. Someone who can offer support, wisdom, and emotional presence without contamination or collapse. They don't avoid suffering, but they no longer merge with it. They no longer carry pain they didn't create. They feel deeply, but from their own center, they've learned what Jung always emphasized. Your sensitivity is not your burden. It's your medicine, but only if it's consciously developed. These integrated empaths don't disappear into others. They don't avoid relationships either. They engage with presence, clarity, and compassion anchored in themselves. This is what the world needs now more than ever. Conscious empaths who can hold collective pain without drowning in it, who can transmute suffering without being consumed by it, who can offer healing not through sacrifice, but through embodied integrity. If you've seen yourself in these words, know this: your overwhelm is not weakness. It's the signal that you've been carrying what was never yours to hold. Your empathy, when integrated, becomes humanity's medicine. Let us know in the comments. Are you reclaiming your empathic power? What stage are you in? If this resonated, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more on Jungian psychology, archetypal healing, and conscious emotional mastery. You were never meant to be a martyr. You were born to be an alchemist.